Hey everyone, happy Figma Friday. Welcome to today's live stream. My name is Josh, and I'm a community manager here at Figma, located in sunny Long Beach, California, just south of LA. And I'm joined today with Tom.
Hey all, I'm Tom. I'm a designer advocate at Figma. I am located in cold, rainy Toronto, Canada.
Cool. So today, we're going to be talking about Sketch to Figma. But first, Tom, what are you doing this weekend?
I wish I could say that I had a lot of exciting plans, but I'm going to pick up a suit. First suit I've bought in a long time. Had to get it fitted, and that's for a wedding that we're going to in a couple of weeks. And then I'm going to do a little bit of woodworking and try to build a shelf this weekend. What about you?
So great. I'm jealous. I wish I had a garage that I could do woodworking. I'd love to do that. Let's see here. So tomorrow my wife and I are going to our friend's baby's 1 year old birthday party, first birthday party. So that will be fun and not really sure what to expect there. And then afterwards, I think we have friends from Kentucky and we're going to a Kentucky Derby party. I've never watched the Kentucky Derby or anything like that. So it'll be
That
fun.
sounds amazing.
Cool. So let's get started here. Hello to everyone in the chat. We'll leave some time at the end for questions. So if you do have any questions, just ping us in the chat. And then, just to kind of set expectations, today's stream will probably be a little shorter. We're just going to kind of cover some basics of like how Figma is a little bit different than Sketch. Walk through our Sketch importer. We have a feature that lets you import Sketch files in. So Tom's going to kind of demo that, and we'll go from there. So, Tom, do you want to get us started?
Sure. Just to sort of like echo what Josh said, we've got lots of users that are interested in Figma and they want to bring their sketch files in. Of course, we have a sketch import. We thought it would be good to just use some real world examples and talk about a couple of things that are different, a couple of things to like expect when you're importing files from Sketch. Not everything maps one-to-one just because there's things that we handle differently in Figma than Sketch does, and I think it's a good idea to just highlight what some of those differences are so that you can keep an eye out for them. And we'll walk through some of those things as we encounter them. And then the other thing that I'll try to cover as well is just give you an idea of like a couple of things that you can do to speed up the process of like getting up to speed in Figma. And, I used a pretty simple file here. I know some people have much more complicated sketch files. I didn't want to get too into the weeds on every obscure sort of like use case, but hopefully everything we covered today will give you a little bit more of an idea of like what's different and how you can get started. So we are in Sketch right now. I've got a design that makes use of some symbols. And so if we go to my symbols page, you can see we've got a couple of icons here. We've got a tab bar, a header, a status bar, and a card. And we've used those across these different artboards. And within each one of these, you can see here, we've got some styles applied. These are all the same type style applied. And then we've got some other things that we've created a layer style for the color. I'll kind of go back and forth here a little bit later on in the stream today to highlight a couple of the differences, but I'll speak to them first. One of the things with Sketch is that the way styles are handled is a little bit different. So when you create a style, things like alignment and the color become sort of part of that style. And those attributes are kind of decoupled in Figma. So the styles don't really map one-to-one. So those won't get carried over in your import, but there's a couple of ways that you can quickly create styles in Figma and apply them to your new Figma document from the Sketch document. So let's head over to Figma now that you've had sort of a little tour of the Sketch file. So here's our project in Figma. And what we're going to do is I'm going to, whoops, I meant to click on, on this little button here called Import File. So if we click on import file, we'll have the ability to choose our sketch file. And then that goes through this little import process. It may take a few more seconds if you have a larger file. And now that has been created as a document in Figma. So if we open them up, you will see that we have a very similar document. So we still have our 3 artboards. One thing to note is that in Figma, we call artboards frames. And I know that's sometimes a little bit confusing if this is your first exposure to Figma, but some of the thinking behind like not using this convention that's existed in a lot of design tools around artboards is that we think of frames as like this kind of paradigm that expands beyond just like what your viewport size is. It's basically a container for a bunch of elements, and those frames could actually exist within other frames. So what I mean by that is you could create a frame for a design. Let's change this to be an iPhone 8 frame. And I could actually create another frame within that design. I could set up constraints left and right and bottom, and I could give it a background color here. And if we anchor that to the bottom, that frame could essentially become like a tab bar that's anchored to our screen. So that's just one big difference. But for the purposes of coming into Figma for the first time, you can treat a frame in the same way that you would treat an artboard. Now, you'll see here that I'll show you what has basically been preserved. So the appearance of these items has been preserved. The fact that these are symbols has been preserved. You'll see here in the pages palette, we have a symbols page. And so very much the same as you would expect in Sketch. Those are all available to you here. And then here is our screen that has some type styles and some colors. So I'll start with the type styles. Let's just zoom in here, and you'll see that this is just a regular text box. So the type style doesn't get carried over for the reasons I mentioned previously. So if you had all of these text styles that were like all through a whole bunch of different screen mockups that you had, one of the things that you can do to speed up this process is if you go to the edit menu, you can say select all with same text. You can also access that if you're in the web browser and you're not using the desktop app. You can access it through this edit menu. And one little quick shortcut is if you hit Command / it brings up a search. And typing in search strings here will actually search all of these menus to find menu commands that are relevant to your selection. So if I select this and say select all with, you'll see I get all these options. And if I say select all with same text properties, it selects all of those items. So the nice thing about that is if I want to create a text style, I can create it, I can select all of these things, and then I can apply the text style at once. So to do that, we select the text style, and you'll see it's Roboto 18 point. The line height is auto. This little 4 dot button brings up our styles palette, so we can create our first text style. So let's just call it body text. And then what we can do is we can click on these other ones and say, use our menu shortcut, select all with same text properties, and then we can quickly apply that type style to all of these things. And you can imagine if you had a whole bunch of different artboards, it would be pretty quick. So now these are all using that new type style. So to show you again how these are different as well, because the properties of the type style aren't all baked into Figma type styles, we kind of handle it in a decoupled way. So if you want to like change the color of all of these, the color of the item is handled independently from the style. So we're not going to prompt you to create a new style just because you changed the color. And then the same thing, if we want to change the alignment of these text boxes, we can just override the alignment. There's no reason to create new styles just because you want to change the alignment of text. So there's also that. And so now that you've created those styles, we can also do the same thing for colors. So if we click on one of these color objects, we've got the same sorts of things. So we can click here, we can call this green, and then I can say, edit, select all with same fill. It's going to select, whoops, I meant to do this one because that has a style applied to it now. Select all with same fill, and then it'll select all of these different elements that I have. And one thing that you'll notice is that and this is the next point I was going to get into, is some of the differences between Figma components and Sketch symbols. That's another thing that has a different name but operates in a very familiar way. But one thing you'll notice is that it's selecting some of these items that are nested within each of these components. And that's because if we flip back over to Sketch, Sketch treats the symbols almost like these flat objects on your canvas. So when you want to manipulate things like these text strings or the colors, you're doing all of that through the overrides panel. And some things are a little trickier to do, and we handle that a little bit differently. And that's because all of these things are selectable as inline items. So if you want to change this to say Josh, you can just click on the item and make that change. So in that spirit, when we do this command, select all with same fill, it is going to select those things. So just something to be aware of. So let's just apply the style to these ones here. So now those all have the same color style. And a better way to like handle these might be doing that on the symbols page. So this is just like another page in your document. I could create this and say select all with same fill, and now it's going to select all of these items within the master component, and then I can apply the color to them. So those are some handy things. And just to bring your attention back to that menu, there's a whole bunch of different things that you can do. So if you have the same drop shadow that's used everywhere, the same stroke, those sorts of things, you can use those to quickly select them and then apply properties all at once. So now let's dig down a little bit into the components themselves. Those all get carried over, and you'll see that your symbols page gets carried over as well. One difference is that because Sketch deals more with local files, one of the challenges bringing the import in is if you are bringing in symbols that are stored in an external library. And so one of the challenges with that is we obviously don't have a way currently to map all of your projects to these symbols that are coming in with existing libraries. So one of the things that you'll find happening, and I don't have something to show you right now, is that if your document does not have master components in it, and those master or master symbols are coming from a shared library, what we do is you'll find a group that gets imported somewhere on your canvas that will be hidden, that'll contain versions of all of those master symbols in them that you can just turn the visibility on if you need to get to them. But if you are bringing in like an existing symbol library or design system into Figma, I would recommend bringing that in first, and then you can publish those components, which I'll show you how to do in a second, so that other files can use them. So for example, if we wanted to share all of these assets out to another file in Figma, it's just as easy as going to your assets panel, clicking on the team library icon, and we click publish. And so now it's going to publish all of these components. And it might take a second just because this is our first publish. We can continue working. And if we go back to our document, we have another document here called Sketch to Figma. Might take a second to publish. There, it's successfully been published. And then in our Sketch to Figma document, what we can do is go back into this team library, and you'll see now that this library now shows up in our list of libraries. And if we toggle that on, immediately all of these symbols become, which are now Figma components, become available to us to drag into another document. So that's really handy. And so one of the things is like, if you were to do another Sketch import and you had versions of those symbols within your file, let's just say like you had a whole bunch of these symbols and then you had already imported your library. Another trick that you can do using that same select all is you can say select all with same instance. So you could select all of them at once. And then from this instance menu, you can actually swap them out to a different version of your component. I know this is sort of like hard to describe, but basically you import your libraries, you publish them, you bring in a Sketch project. Now you want to replace the instances of those symbols with the ones from your library. You can select them all across all of the pages, and then you could quickly change them. So obviously we're already using the card component, but if we wanted to like map those to, the header component, we could just use header, and it applies that to all of the instances all at once. Going back to this file, I think we should probably cover a couple of the other differences with how Figma works that are a little bit different. So in Sketch, when you're setting up things like grids, let me create another artboard. You have, forgetting where all this is now. Josh, do you remember where the grids are?
I think, is it in the preferences? This is how much time we spend in Sketch, everyone.
Yeah, it's very, very rarely. I'm sure somebody's already showing us in the chat.
So under the view settings, you can show grid, and then you have grid settings. So it's in the toolbar, not in the menu. To the right.
Oh, here.
There you go. Yep, grid settings.
Right. So yeah, so you can show your layout grids, and then you have the ability to, sorry, it's been a while. You have the ability to go in here and change your layout grids, and you can enable these different things. One of the things that I find is it gets a little tricky when you need to share or duplicate these grid settings across your different screens, especially if they're changing. So instead of applying them like that, they actually get added in Figma as properties of the actual frame itself. So when we go into add a layout grid here, it's just a matter of like adding that property to the frame, and then you have the ability to customize the grid in the way that you want it. And what's nice about it is that if you have another screen that doesn't use one of those grids, you can actually just go select it, Command C to copy it, and then you can add that grid to really quickly to other frames, and you can also stack them and add as many different grids as you want. So we've got like a uniform grid, a column grid, and a row grid on this one. So if we wanted, we could select all those at once, click on a frame, and apply them really quickly. So that's like one little difference. Another difference is that because of the way frames work and the way that you can have a frame within a frame, we also have this difference of having groups and frames. So for example, if we take these two objects and I add a couple of them onto the canvas, I can select them, I can right click, and I can group them. And so now with a group, the main use case for a group is like to keep these layers together so that they're easier to move and interact with. And then it consolidates all of these items down into one selectable, top level item within your layers panel. And so as you, using something like smart selections to change the spacing between these things, or, changing the size of one of these elements, the bounds of the group are always going to update to the size of whatever those elements are. And so the main use case I would say for groups is like just unifying things so that they're easier to select on your canvas. When you want to get into something that is a little bit more responsive, or something that has a little bit more functionality from a layout perspective, that's where I would recommend using a frame. So if we use sort of like a similar example here, we've drawn a frame. We can put in some similar items here to the other one that we have. And you'll notice that by default, these all get a top left relationship to the frame. So you can see these little dotted lines are showing that they're anchored to the top left. So if we move this frame smaller or bigger, these items are not going to scale by default, but we can independently control the size of it. Whereas like if we selected this group, everything is going to size as one unit. And why this is nice is because a couple of reasons. One is you can clip content. So if this box is checked, when you start resizing this, you can actually hide items, which is really handy. We can cover a couple of use cases for that in a second. And then you can, frames allow you to control the constraints. So if you set constraints inside a group, they're always going to be relative to the parent frame. So if you need the objects inside your element to be pinned in some way, so if we wanted this to be to the top right, and this one to be the bottom center and this one top left, then we can do that. But that will not work in a group unless it's within a frame. So whenever you need that functionality, I recommend using a frame. Anything to add there, Josh, on frames?
No, I think you pretty much covered it. I know when I initially switched to Figma, it was a little bit confusing. The quick shortcut, I may have missed this, is to hold Command to resize without constraints.
So no, that's a really great tip. Just to demonstrate that, by default, once you've set up these constraints, you can see what they're anchored to. We size this down. This is all great, but there's going to be times where you may want to resize this. Like maybe you want this to stay in one position, and when you're scaling this frame down, you don't want that thing to move. As Josh just said, if you hold Command, it will scale the item without applying those constraints. And then when you let go of Command and do it again, it'll continue, resizing with the constraints. That's a really handy tip.
And then, yeah, the only other thing too with frames, so in Sketch you have symbols, which is like an object type, and those symbols live on a symbols page, and then their instances are within that. They can also live with Sketch libraries within a different Sketch file. In Figma, our components are technically also frames that we then turn into a component. So if you ever create a component, you'll notice that when you do that, it actually will convert it into a frame, which is nice because that means all of our components then have the ability to have constraints applied to them. Right? I'm thinking about that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I always tell people the same thing. It's like when you create components, think of them as frames. They basically have the same behavior that we showed earlier as like frames in frames. So that may be pretty helpful. Another difference to cover while we're talking about components as well, we've talked about how in each of these components we can obviously click inside them. In Sketch, there's a lot of people that are like nesting components or nesting symbols with another symbols, and then they'll often swap them out. You can do the same thing in Figma, but there's a couple of different ways to do it. So right now you can see we have this little commenting icon, and we have a like icon. These are our nested symbols. The masters are found here. And Sketch, you can access this through an instance menu. Same thing applies. The only thing is that you don't have to select this top level component. You can actually just deep click down into the actual component you want to change itself, and then you get access to the instance menu for that particular item. And so if you click on that, you'll see that any related components or any other components in your file can be accessed from here. And in the same way that you'd have like this tree menu of all of your components, you can do that in Figma as well. So if we wanted to swap the order of these things, I could change this one to the like one, and I could change this one to the commenting one. Really easy to do. Those could also be coming from a shared library. And another thing about that is the way that they're organized, which I'll get into in 1 second, but I just want to highlight another way of doing the same thing. So if we flip over to, and this is going to be a different way of navigating components than you're used to in Sketch. We have the symbols panel. So you can see, here's a list of all of our symbols. Obviously, this gets a lot bigger when you have a larger design system, but you can search and filter out this list. So if we were just looking for the like component, we just type in like, and it gives us that component that we can drag into our design. So the next question is, that's great, I can drag this thing into my canvas, but what about these things that are nested within other components? So there's two things here. One is if we drag this out, by default, it's going to place it on the canvas. But if we hold Option, you can see that it highlights this border around a particular component that I'm hovering over, and that will replace a top-level component. So if I wanted to replace this entire card with the symbol, holding Option, if I let go, it's going to replace that whole instance with this symbol. Now I'm just going to undo. Let's do the same thing, but in this case, I'm going to hold Command and Option. And what you'll see is it now allows us to select deep down into the nested components. So if I wanted to swap these out, it's just a matter of doing that. So that's a much more visual way. So I think somebody was asking about a quick way to add components. Generally speaking, what I do is I'll be working in the layers panel. I'll hit option 2 to switch between option 1 and 2 will switch between your layers palette and your assets. And so what I'll do is I'll switch to assets. I'll do a search for my card, and then I'll just drag them into my design, and I'll go back and I'll just sort of search for the things I'm looking for and drag them in. And if I don't know what to find or what they're called, I have a visual representation that I can look through here.
And then also on that, I'm not sure, a quick way to add components, that's how you would add like instances into your file or the component. If you're asking Scarno about how to create components, we do have a shortcut for that too, which is, I have to look at my keyboard here, Option Command K. So if you create a shape, you can just select that within your layers panel or on the canvas, and then Option Command K will turn that into a component, which is kind of nice. So we treat things a little bit differently. I know in Sketch, you kind of have this drop down that then appears to name your component, and it inherits the name of the layer. We kind of do the same thing, but it's just another item within the layers panel. So whatever you name it there, it's also going to be named within that library. So
yeah, and I mean, I think another big thing, you can do this in Sketch too, but Sketch by default isn't set up to do this, I think, unless you set a user preference. But when you create these components, they get created in line rather than being sent to like a symbols page. I'd say like we have a real mix of users who prefer it both ways. So by default, it's going to happen in place. But if you wanted to move this rectangle component to the symbols page, you can just right click on it and say move to page in symbols. The reason being is that I'll show you another example. I'm going to take this symbol, and I'm going to detach it, and I'm going to turn it into a new Figma component. And so one of the reasons why a lot of people like to just create them in line is because now you can be working on this thing in context. So maybe there's like other things in your design, grids or alignments that you want to create between elements. Sometimes it's nice to be able to just edit these things in line and see how they update and look across a number of different screens. And then at any given point, if you're doing a bit of tidy up and you don't want those masters to live there, you could move them to another page. And of course, the other thing to note is that I guess just that there are going to be a couple things that work a little bit differently with those overrides. And there are going to be a couple things that when you start organizing your components on your symbols page or in a shared library, that are a little bit different. So the example that I have here is like is these two. A lot of people will use the / naming. And so if we make an instance of one of these, you'll see that when we go into like our symbols, you'll see that they get sorted in the exact same way that they do in Sketch. This can be really great, but for larger design systems, the / naming sometimes gets a bit long. So we've heard a lot of feedback that, when you're dealing with the layers panel and you've got like, icons, / category, / size, / icon name, sometimes they get truncated in the layers panel because the names are really long. It becomes harder to like synchronize between what you're calling these things in development and what you're calling them in the design tool. So we do offer one other way. So I'm going to use another Sketch import to illustrate this. I'm going to import a file. This is just a Sketch file that contains a bunch of Google material icons. So this one may take a few more seconds to import. Here we go. And so if we go into this file, you can see that all this file is just a whole bunch of Sketch symbols that have been converted to Figma components. And you can see here that they've got a prefix here. So all of these icons are categorized. So you can see we've got all of these action icons with a / action prefix. You could just publish this library and you could start using these icons right away without having to do anything. But another way you can do it in Figma is actually you can use your pages and frame names to categorize and organize these things. So let's just say we called this frame or this page icons. One of the things that we could do is we could go into our layers panel and we could select, there are a lot of action icons. We could select all of these action icons. So you can see they're all selected now. And what I can do is do Command Option G, and that's actually going to group them into a frame now. So I'm going to call that action. And then, here's our alerts, Command Option G. So here's our alerts. And then we'll do one more for the purposes of demoing this. And we'll convert all of our AV icons here. One more. So now those have all been organized. So now they're on the icons page. They're in these frames. A lot of people will often lay them out with a backdrop or what the icon names are beside them and present them in a nice way in case people have confusion of how to use these icons or what function they're supposed to serve. And then what you can do is we have a batch rename. So if I was to select all of these AV icons, I can say Command R, and that brings up our batch renaming dialog. So this will allow me to rename 80 layers at once. So because these icons are all within a frame called AV, what I could do is say, I want to match AV / and I want to remove that prefix from all the icon names. So I've hit rename. Those have all been renamed now. So the nice thing, just to show you what this results in, let's just say I have an instance somewhere on my canvas and I want to access it. You'll see here when we click on this instance, we've got, there's a mix of things here, but if I go into the AV page or this AV category, it's still sorting all of these things into the right buckets, even though I don't have that / prefix on them, because now it's reading that sort of hierarchy based on the pages and the frame names. So rather than having all those prefixes in the names, I've got these nice clean names. And of course, this just gets exemplified the more levels that you have. Again, you can still use the / naming, but this is just another difference that we allow you to do. And by doing it this way, when you go into your assets panel, I'm going to go into this view, you'll see that they get categorized under these different headlines now that make it easy for you to browse through the icons. Anything else to add, Josh?
No, I mean, in general, when I first switched over, I ended up using that instance kind of drop down because that's what I was used to. But now I rarely actually go over to that instance, and I almost always use the assets panel and then using option to kind of swap those out. So kind of getting used to that and being able to search is definitely great. There was a question from Dan, is there search and selection available? We don't have that yet in terms of being able to search layers and then have those become selected. But that is something, we'd love to include. I know search is kind of a big thing, both across the canvas within specific files, but also across all your files and projects. So stay tuned on that.
For sure. And if you've been using Sketch, the version control is always localized in the sense that it's a local version that's on your computer, unless you're using some other software with it to facilitate that. One thing that I'll just highlight is once you bring your Sketch files in, you can always show a version history of the file. So you saw that we just at the beginning of the stream brought in the file. If we want to see what this file looked like at 3:10 p.m., you can see this is what it looks like. So this on pro accounts and our organization accounts, this version history goes on for forever since the file's creation. So if you ever need to return to a past version, you can. If you wanted to make a copy of your file from a past point in time because you want to go back and grab something, you just click on this little ellipse menu and you can duplicate it. You can also restore or give it a name if this is a point in time that you want to come back to. So this versioning is it starts up automatically. There's nothing that you have to do, and that is available to like every file that you bring into Figma. I think there was also a question about prototyping. Just because of the way we handle prototyping connections and the different types of interactions, the prototyping connections that you make in Sketch don't carry over to Figma, but they are pretty easy to create. One thing that really comes in handy in Figma is that often when you're building prototypes, you actually want to link interactions from within these components. So for example, like if you had a tab bar on Sketch, this is generally speaking like a pretty flat object, and you'd have to draw hotspots over the different areas that you want to link. Because in Figma, your component instances allow you to like actually like break down and see the breakdown of those layers, and actually individually select objects. I could actually link a prototype connection from an element that's within a component. So that becomes really powerful if, like, using this example, if you want some interaction to happen when you click on the like button and a different interaction to happen when you click on the commenting button, and maybe this ellipse menu has a different interaction, and maybe this username is going to take you to the person's profile. Those are like 4 interactions that are happening within one component, and you don't have to draw any hotspots to do it. So there are definitely some things that are going to be different. Not everything is a one-to-one mapping. And so I guess, stepping back from it all, I always describe our Sketch import as being like, it's a really great starting point to save you a lot of like work in recreating things, but it is a good exercise to go through if you're new to Figma and learn the nuances between some of these things, because there's often a lot of ways to add some efficiencies into the way that you're building some of your components so that they're a little easier for people to use. One example of that is, maybe this post doesn't have a description. Rather than having to have like 2 components, maybe description's a bad example, but having 2 components for a very simple variation between the 2 and having to maintain those 2 components. In Figma, because you can like deep dive into these individual layers, you also have the ability to toggle visibility. So if I didn't want to show a particular element in a particular state, I could just toggle that layer's visibility. So when you think of things like, a checkbox or a radio button, you may not have to create 2 symbols to do that radio button or the checkbox. You could just create one, and you can simply toggle off the, the circle or the checkbox when you want to show those different states. So there's lots of possibilities on how you may set those things up, but it is definitely a good exercise to just go through and sort of see how the 2 platforms are a bit different, and where you might be able to sort of like simplify things down in your project. I think there's a question here about constraints. Yeah, so there is ways to, the constraint system is pretty similar. Some constraints will get mapped over, the ones that are different don't. But basically, yeah, when you create something in Figma, there's a pretty similar UI. If I want to like pin this to the right and the top, by default, we fix the size of this element. It doesn't scale. So you don't have to worry about, setting the fixed size option. And the same thing if we did it over here, top left, it would just stay there when we resize. So the constraints are pretty comparable. Anything else to add on constraints, Josh?
No.
Another question was, focus on the layer list and navigate with my keyboard. Josh, do you know a little bit more? There are a few different ways to navigate with the keyboard through Figma.
Yeah, so once you're on the layer list, you need to select first at least one layer. That's probably an improvement we can make, where when you're on the having something being able to select. But then you can just use tab to kind of go through it, shift tab to go up a layer, and then enter will kind of enter into a group, and then it's shift enter to escape that group. So I know that's another shortcut that's a little different. I think Sketch uses escape to get out of a group when you're navigating the layer list, but we use Shift Enter because we use escape for a few different other things. And if you're like in full screen mode on the browser, it would exit that if you hit escape. So yeah, that hopefully helps. Yeah, I think we're going to wrap up here. This is a little shorter of a stream. I did want to, let me switch to my screen real quick. So I did just want to show something. So if you are new and you're coming from Sketch or maybe a different tool, or maybe you're just getting into design and all of this is new, I just wanted to share some resources. So you're on YouTube right now watching this, but definitely check out our other videos. We have created a bunch of great kind of getting started, some basics, components. Check out our live stream. So Tom and I have done a few of these now. I think this is like 7 or 8 now. But we've done another Figma 101. We've done one on components. So if you are new, definitely check those out. They're great resources. We also have a help center where our support team has written a ton of these documents that kind of go through it. So if videos aren't your style, we have a bunch of things. So like here's one on importing. So we talk about importing sketch files and how to go through that. And then lastly, we just made some updates. So our community is on Spectrum. So spectrum.chat/Figma. We'll leave a link in the description here. But we just made some updates. So we kind of support is all going to be handled through Figma. So if you have a bug or a feature request, there's a little question mark in the bottom right. And then you can say get help. And then it actually accesses the same files or the same help articles. But if you go over to ask and then email, you have these drop downs. So if you have a product question, bug report, feature request, we recommend funneling all of your questions related to the product or like bug reports if you find an issue. Or if you have an improvement, go through here. This is the best way to get a response quickly. And also our team, our support team is able to tag them, organize them, and then they have weekly meetings with our product and engineering teams to kind of make sure that we are building the things that all of our users actually want us to build. But yeah, so going back to Spectrum, we have a bunch of new channels here. So kind of around areas within Figma. So we have design systems, extensions, open design, which is just a space for you to kind of share your work. Maybe you've created a resource, prototyping, and then workflow and process. So workflow and process is a great one. So if you're new to Figma, definitely check this out. So, kind of learn how people are using pages or, scaling text within components, whether people are using the desktop app or browser. A ton of great conversations are happening. So that's my little plug. Being the community manager, I kind of have to do that. But yeah, and then if you do have any other questions, Tom and I are both active on Twitter, so you can reach out to us there, or Figma's official Twitter account as well. Anything to add, Tom?
No, we're happy to help whenever possible. So yeah, I think there's lots of users that have gone through similar like Sketch to Figma transitions, just because their team really needed that sort of live collaboration, which we didn't touch on a lot, but basically you probably saw Josh and I zooming around this file at the same time, which is really powerful when you just want to have a collaborative real-time process. Josh, I don't know if you can flip back to my screen. The other thing I just wanted to highlight too, like as part of the resources, figma.com/resources, there's a couple of great resources. Here's one from Marco Pacifico, and then another one by Chris Godby, who have talked about like their experiences in switching their teams. So if you want to learn a little bit more about like what their process looked like and how it went for them, these are two great resources that I think are worth checking out for sure.
Cool. Awesome. So yeah, feel free to reach out. We're going to be continuing to do these streams. If you have any questions, let us know. And happy Friday. Hope everyone has a great weekend. Bye.
Have a great weekend. I'll take care.